I was in the middle of translating a trade dispute about mineral rights on a moon no one had ever visited when the message arrived. It did not knock. It did not wait. It cut through every active channel on the Galactic Council station simultaneously, overriding 17 ongoing sessions, bypassing 3 layers of diplomatic encryption, and landing on every delegate console, every staff terminal, and every personal communication device within the station at the exact same moment. 7 words. In the Galactic Standard Tongue, it read, "The humans are coming. They request audience. I am Kale, 7. I have served as a xenolinguist for the Council for 11 years. My job is to sit in the translator's booth, press my ear to the strange music of alien speech, and give it back to the room in words everyone can understand. I have translated declarations of war. I have translated surrender terms. I have translated the final testimony of a dying civilization asking the Council to remember their name. I have never, in 11 years, seen the chamber go quiet the way it went quiet after those 7 words. Not silent the way a room goes silent when someone drops something. Silent the way a room goes silent when everyone in it suddenly forgets how to breathe. The Vorith Precept, elder delegate of the oldest surviving civilization in the mapped galaxy, a being who had personally witnessed 3 interspecies conflicts and survived all of them through a combination of political genius and physical durability that bordered on supernatural, slowly set down the ceremonial drinking vessel it had been holding. The vessel touched the desk without a sound. The precept did not move again. The Dreth Collective's 3-delegate cluster, which communicated internally through a constant low hum audible to sensitive ears, went completely silent. No hum. Nothing. The representatives of the San Federation, who had been arguing about the mineral moon dispute so passionately that 2 of them had been on their feet, sat down. They did not look at each other. They looked at the message on their consoles and they sat down. I sat in my booth above the chamber floor and I looked at those 7 words and I felt something I did not have a clinical name for. Not quite fear. Something older than fear. Something that lives in the body before the mind has time to catch up. I had heard the word humans before, of course. Every council employee had. But we heard it the way you hear a word in a restricted archive, behind locks, in documents stamped with the Omega-9 classification marker. You heard it in whispers in the staff corridors, usually followed by a quick glance over a shoulder. You heard it in the way people do not say a thing directly but circle around it until the shape of it becomes clear. Humans were not a forbidden topic. They were a topic that had been quietly, systematically made uncomfortable to discuss. There was a reason for this. Nobody had explained the reason to me in the 11 years I had worked for the Council, but I had learned, as all Council staff eventually learn, that the reason existed and that asking about it was not a path that led anywhere good. The chamber sat in silence for 43 seconds. I counted. Then the precept of the Vorith hegemony did something I had never seen in 11 years of watching galactic diplomacy. It lowered its recognition tendrils. All 6 of them. For those unfamiliar with Vorith body language, the recognition tendrils are the 6 sensory appendages that curve from the upper body of an adult Vorith. They are almost always elevated during formal sessions. Lowering 1 is a gesture of deep personal respect. Lowering 2 means profound acknowledgement of a serious situation. I had never seen a Vorith lower more than 2 at once. The precept lowered all 6, and they curled inward, toward its body, and it bowed its head. The universal sign, across 100 cultures that had independently developed it in various forms, of genuine fear. Not performed fear. Not diplomatic fear, the kind you display to signal that you take a threat seriously. The real kind. The kind that reaches through 4,000 years of experience and careful political armor and finds the creature underneath. I stared at the precept and I thought, whatever a human is, it is not what I assumed it was. The Council session coordinator, a meticulous San administrator named Vel who had worked the chamber floor longer than I had been alive, appeared at the central podium. Vel's voice was perfectly level. Vel's voice was always perfectly level. It was the thing everyone on staff admired most about Vel. The Council will recess, Vel said. Emergency Protocol 7. All non-essential personnel will clear the chamber. I began to gather my translation equipment. Kale, 7, Vel's voice stopped me. You will remain. Senior xenolinguistic staff only. The humans have transmitted a request. They wish to conduct all communication in their own language and require full translation support. I set my equipment back down. The humans, Vel continued, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing each word with extreme precision, have specified that their lead delegate does not speak Galactic Standard. They will speak only in English. English. I knew English. I was one of perhaps 30 council staff members who had been trained in it, as part of a xenolinguistics program that officially studied all known language families, including those of species under quarantine. I had studied English the way you study a language in a textbook. Theoretically. Academically. I had never expected to use it in a live session. The chamber was clearing around me. Delegates filed out in tight, quiet groups, none of them speaking, all of them moving with the particular hurried calm of people who have decided that panic is not yet appropriate but are keeping it very close at hand. I stayed in my booth. I looked at the message again. The humans are coming. They request audience. Below me, the chamber settled into stillness. The great circular table, built to seat representatives of 47 species, sat empty under the overhead lights. The ceremonial seals of every council member species glowed softly on the walls. Somewhere beyond the station's outer hull, crossing the boundary of the docking approach corridor, a human ship was on its way in. I pulled up my English language files on my personal terminal. I had not opened them in 2 years. I began to review. I did not know what was coming. But the precept of the Vorath hegemony, 4,000 years old and unshaken by everything the galaxy had ever thrown at it, had lowered all 6 of its tendrils and bowed its head. And I had the distinct, irrational, completely unprofessional feeling that whatever was about to walk through the chamber door, it was going to change everything I thought I understood about the universe. I was right. I just did not yet understand how thoroughly. Outside the viewport at the end of the corridor behind my booth, I could see the docking approach lights beginning to blink their slow, patient welcome. The humans were coming. And the most powerful diplomatic body in the known galaxy was sitting very, very still, waiting for them. What the quarantine was really for. They pulled me into a briefing room that smelled of recycled air and quiet dread, and they handed me a data tablet with a clearance level stamped on its top edge that I had never seen before in my career. Omega 9 restricted. Eyes only. There were 6 of us in the room. 2 senior council administrators, one from the Vorath hegemony and one from the San Federation. A security officer whose species I did not recognize, which was unusual for someone at my level of clearance exposure. An archivist named Palin, who was the oldest member of the council's xenolinguistics division and who had, until this moment, never once spoken to me directly despite 11 years of working in the same department. And me. The Vorath administrator, whose name translated roughly as Deep Current, did not waste time. The human vessel will dock in 4 hours, it said. You will be the primary translator for all contact sessions. Before that contact begins, you need to understand what you are translating for. Not who. What. It nodded to Palin. Palin set a second data tablet on the table in front of me. Read the summary first. Then we will answer questions. I read the summary. It took me 6 minutes. When I finished, I set the tablet down very carefully, and I looked at the wall across from me, and I took a slow breath. The quarantine, I said. It was never to protect the rest of the galaxy from them. No, Palin said. It was not. Here is what the Omega 9 files contained, in the order I processed them. 212 years ago, when humanity first achieved faster-than-light travel, the Galactic Council sent an unmanned contact probe to observe. Standard procedure for any newly spacefaring species. The probe was equipped with psychological assessment arrays, cultural sampling tools, and a passive communication monitor. It spent 14 months near the human home system, recording. What it recorded was sent back to the Council and immediately classified. The psychological profile of the human species was unlike anything the Council's xenopsychologists had encountered in 400 years of contact work. Every other spacefaring species ever catalogued, without exception, shared a core trait in their threat response. When faced with a danger significantly larger than their capacity to counter, they experienced something that functioned like a biological governor. A switch. The assessment of the threat triggered retreat, dispersal, or submission. Some species fought hard before that switch flipped, but the switch always flipped. It was, the Council's scientists had concluded, an evolutionary feature, not a flaw. Civilizations that did not have it tended not to survive long enough to develop space travel. Humans did not have the switch. Or, more precisely, they had something where the switch should have been, but it did not function the same way. The Council's xenopsychologists had spent decades trying to accurately describe it. The closest any of them had come was a phrase buried in a secondary report that I read twice: recursively motivated under duress. The more severe the situation, the more focused they became. Not fearless. The psychological data was clear on that. Humans experienced fear. They experienced it intensely and frequently. But the fear did not shut them down. It sharpened them. The worse things got, the harder they concentrated, the more creatively they thought, and the more willing they became to attempt things that, under normal circumstances, they would have recognized as unreasonable. This was the thing that had sent the Council's first contact team into emergency session 200 years ago. Not aggression. Not hostility. The simple, deeply unsettling fact that humanity's survival mechanism did not have an upper limit. Every other species had a point at which the rational response was to stop and accept the outcome. Humans appeared to experience that point and then continue anyway. I turned to the section labeled the Kepler incident. I had heard the phrase before, vaguely, the way you hear the name of a historical event that everyone knows was significant without knowing exactly what happened. It was listed in basic Council history as a border security incident in the early human contact period. An unfortunate misunderstanding. Resolved diplomatically. What the Omega-9 file described was not a misunderstanding. A human colony vessel, carrying 412 colonists to a newly charted system, had been intercepted by a Dreth Collective patrol group. The Dreth Collective, at that time, was running an aggressive border expansion campaign. They had intercepted colony ships from 3 other species in the previous 2 years. In each case, the colony ship had halted, signaled distress, and the situation had been resolved through a combination of negotiated surrender and territorial concession. The Dreth were good at this. They had learned that smaller vessels with civilians aboard responded to military force by shutting down and waiting for rescue. The human colony ship did not shut down. It transmitted one message to the patrol group. In the language the Dreth used for interspecies communication at the time, which was one of 47 languages loaded into its communication array, the message said, "You have 1 hour to withdraw." The Dreth patrol group was composed of 6 vessels. This was not a small force. 6 Dreth patrol vessels represented enough firepower to neutralize a mid-sized military installation. The Dreth did not withdraw. After 1 hour and 3 minutes, which the file noted was due to a communication delay and not a breach of the stated terms, the colony ship, still carrying all 412 colonists, engaged the patrol group. I want to be precise about what followed, because the file was precise, and I think that precision matters. The colony ship was a converted transport vessel. It had 2 functional defensive systems and 1 forward-mounted equipment laser designed for asteroid clearing. It was not a warship. It had never been intended to fight anything. It destroyed all 6 Dreth patrol vessels in under 9 minutes. The file included the tactical reconstruction. I read it twice. The approach the human pilot used should not have worked. It was not a strategy any Council military analyst would have considered viable. It was aggressive to the point of appearing irrational, and it relied on the assumption that the Dreth would not expect it, which they did not, because no rational actor would have tried it. The colony ship took significant damage. No colonists were lost. The human vessel then transmitted a second message to the Dreth Collective Command, in the same language as the first. It said, "We are sorry for the delay in our response. We hope this situation can be resolved peacefully going forward. We are continuing to our destination." And then it continued to its destination. I set the tablet down. The Dreth withdrew their border expansion program, Deep Current said quietly. Completely. Within 6 months. They never publicly stated why. Because they were afraid, I said. Because the data they collected on that engagement could not be explained by any military model they possessed. And what cannot be explained in military terms is, to the Dreth, more frightening than anything that can be. Deep Current paused. The Council reviewed the incident and made a decision. Humanity was young. They had not yet built a significant fleet. If they were to be quarantined, this was the moment. It would be presented as mutual protection. For their safety and the safety of the galaxy during a sensitive developmental period. But it was actually, I said slowly, to give the rest of the galaxy time to figure out what to do with them. Pelin nodded once. Have they, I asked, figured out what to do? No one answered. The security officer whose species I did not recognize looked out the viewport. The archivist examined the table surface. Deep current was very still. No, said the San administrator, who had not spoken until now. Which is why, when the humans asked for an audience, we could not refuse. We have no framework for refusing them, not really. They are not a threat we know how to contain. They are a question we do not know how to answer. 4 hours until docking. I looked at my English vocabulary files on the tablet they had given me. A question we do not know how to answer. The thought followed me out of the briefing room. It sat beside me in the corridor. It was still there when, 2 hours later, I stood at the observation port of Docking Bay 7 and watched a small, battered, clearly exhausted ship come in from the dark. It was not what I expected. It was a converted freight hauler. Its hull was patched in at least 11 places I could count from where I stood, with material that did not match the original panels. It was smaller than the private transport vessels council delegates used for personal travel. It looked like it had been pushed hard for a long time and had kept going, not because it was well maintained but because someone aboard it had refused to let it stop. The docking clamps engaged. The outer door seal completed. The inner door opened. 3 humans walked out. The first was a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with close-cut dark hair and the kind of posture that does not come from comfort but from a long habit of standing up straight when everything around you is difficult. She walked like someone who was tired down to the center of their bones and had decided not to let it show. Her name, I would learn, was Yara Osei. She was a commander in the Human Exploration Corps. Behind her was a man in his 50s with a scientist's distracted eyes and hands that would not quite stay still, moving as if they were looking for something to calculate. His name was Dr. Piotr Vance. The third was young. Very young. 22, I would later learn. A navigator. His name was Callum Ward. He had a deep cut above his left ear that had been recently bandaged, and he was walking carefully, the way you walk when something hurts and you are trying not to let it change how you move. They had clearly been through something before they arrived. Yara Osei scanned the docking bay with eyes that were alert and measuring and, I noticed, not particularly impressed by what they saw. She looked at the council welcome delegation. She looked at the security detail. She looked at me, in my translator's identification jacket, and gave a small nod. Then she looked back at the corridor they had just come through, back at her ship, and something crossed her face. Something private. Then she turned forward again and walked toward the welcome delegation as if she had been doing this all her life. She had not come to ask for help. I understood that before she said a single word. I did not understand yet what she had come for instead. But my translation files were ready, my earpiece was in, and the most interesting, most frightening, most thoroughly unexpected conversation in Galactic Council history was about to begin. I pressed the record button. And listened. What the humans found at the edge. Yara Osei did not sit down when she was shown to the chair. She stood behind it, one hand resting on its back, and looked around the chamber with the steady, unhurried attention of a person taking inventory. I watched her from my translator's position, 3 steps to her right and slightly behind, and I noted the way her gaze moved, methodically, section by section, without lingering on anything that was not useful. She was not impressed or intimidated. She was assessing. The chamber had 47 delegate positions arranged in the traditional concentric arc for this emergency session, 39 were filled. The other 8 delegations had declined to attend, citing protocol concerns, which was diplomatic language for we are frightened and would prefer not to be in the room. The Vorith Precept occupied the central high seat, its recognition tendrils held at a careful neutral elevation, neither threatening nor welcoming. It watched Yara Osei with all 4 of its primary visual organs. Vel called the session open. I translated. Yara listened to my rendering with the focus of someone who was checking my accuracy even without fully knowing the language, which is a skill I had only ever seen in the most experienced diplomatic professionals. Piotr Vance placed a storage device on the table before him and connected it to the chamber's central display system. Callum Ward sat very still and said nothing, which I was beginning to understand was his default mode, a stillness that was not passivity but concentration. "We will make this brief," Yara said. I translated. "We are not here to renegotiate the quarantine terms. We are not here to make a political case for human integration into the Council. Those conversations can happen later or not at all, and we are comfortable with either outcome." She paused. "We are here because 11 months ago, one of our deep-range survey vessels found something at the outer edge of mapped space that everyone in this room needs to know about. And we decided that the ethical thing to do was to tell you." I translated. The chamber was quiet in the way a held breath is quiet. Piotr Vance activated the display. What appeared on the chamber's central screen was a star map. Not of the inner systems, not of the populated regions. Of the far edge. The territory past the last Council outpost, past the last exploration marker, where the mapped galaxy gives way to the dark and the dark gives way to nothing charted. 17 systems were highlighted in a deep amber light. These systems were all catalogued by Council survey teams between 40 and 80 years ago, Yara said. Each one had a functioning star at the time of survey. Stable. Middle-aged. Not unusual in any way. Vance advanced the display to a second image, sensor data from the human deep-range survey vessel, taken 11 months ago. The 17 highlighted systems were dark. Not nova-dark, the specific light signature of a star that has collapsed under its own weight. Not the cooler amber of a red dwarf fading on its natural timeline. Dark the way a candle goes dark when something puts it out. 17 stars. No light. No residual heat signature consistent with natural stellar death. Just absence. The chamber stayed quiet. The human survey team spent 4 months collecting data, Yara continued. They called us. We sent a scientific team. Then we sent another. 11 months of analysis. And what the data shows is a pattern. Vance brought up the third image. A projection, not of what was, but of what the pattern predicted. Lines of trajectory, extrapolated forward. The dark region was moving. Not randomly. In a specific direction, at a measurable rate, consuming everything in its path. The lines converged. They ran directly through the center of the mapped galaxy. Through the heart of every major civilization present in the room. Through the human home system. One delegate, from the smaller federation near the outer rim, made a sound that did not need translation. We estimate, Yara said, approximately 40 years before the leading edge of the phenomenon reaches the first populated systems. Give or take 4 years depending on variables we cannot yet fully model. I translated. My voice was level. I was very focused on keeping it level. What is it? The Vorath precept asked. Its voice, through my earpiece, was the deep resonant frequency of a being accustomed to speaking in rooms where it expected to be obeyed. Yara looked at the precept directly. We do not know yet. It is not a natural stellar event. The pattern of consumption is too regular. Too structured. It has a rhythm. Which means it has a mechanism. What that mechanism is, we have not determined. You are suggesting it is artificial, said the Dreth Collective's primary voice. I am suggesting the data does not support a natural explanation. I am not suggesting anything beyond what the data supports. The San representative leaned forward. How long have you known about this? 11 months since confirmed analysis. The initial survey data is 18 months old. And in 18 months, said the San representative, the careful neutrality in its voice cracking very slightly, you did not contact the Council. We spent 14 months verifying the data before we were certain enough to bring it to anyone, Yara said. We did not want to cause a crisis on incomplete information. The room erupted. Not loudly. This was not a shouting kind of eruption. It was quieter and more unsettling than that. Delegates began speaking to each other in their own languages, quickly and low, the chamber filling with a dozen overlapping whispered conversations. I could hear fragments, fabricated, manipulation, protocol, impossible, 40 years. 3 of the smaller delegations were already consulting their remote staff. The Dreth cluster was humming again, their internal communication frequency elevated. I watched Yara Osei through all of this. She stood at the table and let it happen. She did not attempt to speak over it. She did not show impatience. She waited with the absolute patience of someone who had expected this response and had decided in advance to let it run its course. Vel called for order. The chamber gradually settled. The council will recess to consult, the Vorith precept said. 1 standard hour. Vel confirmed the recess. The delegates began to file out through the rear corridors. I started to follow. Kale. It was the first time Yara Osei had said my name. I had introduced myself when I was brought to the chamber, a brief professional exchange. She had listened carefully, the way she listened to everything, and apparently she had kept it. I stopped. Turned. Can you stay a moment? The chamber was emptying. Vel gave me a glance that was not quite a question. I gave a small nod that was not quite an answer. Vel left. Yara came around the table and stood near the viewport that ran the length of the chamber's outer wall. Callum Ward remained at the table, working on the datapad he had produced from his jacket pocket. Vance was reviewing the display data, making quiet notations. How long have you worked for the council? Yara asked me. In English. Her English was direct and undecorated. 11 years, I said, in English. The word felt strange in my mouth. Real in a way the textbook version had not been. She looked out the viewport. The station's docking ring was visible from here, a curve of lit metal against the dark. Do you think they will vote to cooperate? I considered giving a professional non-answer. I was trained in professional non-answers. I had given them in 1,000 conversations over 11 years. No, I said instead. Not in the first vote. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already calculated. We thought not. That is why we brought the full data set rather than a summary. We wanted the record to show we held nothing back. You are thinking about what happens after the vote, I said. I am always thinking about what happens after. She turned from the viewport and looked at me directly. She had very steady eyes. The kind of eyes that have seen something large and difficult and have decided to look at it clearly rather than away. If the council votes against cooperation, humanity will pursue an independent response. We have been planning for that possibility for 8 years. 8 years. The survey data was 18 months old. You knew something was wrong before you found the stars. We suspected. Our long-range instruments picked up anomalies in the outer rim 4 years before the survey mission confirmed them. We did not know what we were looking at. But we started planning anyway. In case of an extinction-level event crossing the galaxy toward them. They had started planning. And then when the confirmation arrived, they had spent 14 months making certain before they told anyone. I thought about the Omega-9 files. Recursively motivated under duress. Commander, I said. I did not know what I was going to say until I was saying it. The Council knows things about humanity that are not in public records. It affects how they respond to you. I think you should know that. She was quiet for a moment. We know, she said. We have always known there were files. We know roughly what is in them. The Kepler incident is not a secret on our side. A small, brief expression crossed her face, something between tired and wry. We have made mistakes. We know that too. The Council is afraid of you, I said. I know. And yet you came here anyway. Yes, she picked up her translation earpiece from the table and turned it in her hand. Because being afraid of someone is not a reason to leave them to face this alone. And because if we do not at least try to work together first, the independent option becomes the only option. And the independent option is, she paused, measuring the word, costly. Costly. The word landed quietly. I thought about the tactical reconstruction in the Omega-9 file. The colony ship against 6 military vessels. The choice the human pilot had made. The math of it. Costly but not unthinkable. What do you need from me? I asked. Translate accurately. Do not soften what we say to make it more comfortable for the room. Translate it the way we mean it. She put the earpiece back on the table. We are not here to frighten anyone. But we need them to understand the actual situation, not a polished version of it. I understand. She looked at me for a moment with those steady eyes. "You are not what I expected from a council translator," she said. "You are not what I expected from a human," I replied. Something shifted in her expression, very briefly. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than that. Callum Ward looked up from his datapad. "The recess will end in 12 minutes, he said quietly. He had been keeping track. Yara turned back toward the table. "Then let us be ready." I returned to my position. The delegates came back in ones and twos. The chamber filled again with the particular tension of a room full of beings who have just spent an hour confirming, quietly, among themselves, that they are all afraid of the same thing. I put my earpiece in. I pressed the record button. I was ready. The vote that divided the stars. Vel called the session back to order at exactly the 1 hour mark. The atmosphere in the chamber was different now. When the delegates had filed out for recess, there had been a sense of controlled chaos, the barely managed disorder of people receiving unexpected information and needing space to process it. When they filed back in, the chaos was gone. What replaced it was worse. It was decision. Everyone in the room had made up their minds during that hour. I could feel it, the way you can feel a current in water you are standing in. The question was not whether they had decided but what they had decided and whether the decisions aligned. Vel did not open with protocol greetings, which told me that even Vel, meticulous Vel who had managed this chamber for 30 years, understood that this was not a moment for the usual forms. "The Council will conduct a formal response vote on the following question," Vel said. "Shall the Galactic Council accept the evidence presented by the human delegation and enter into a formal joint crisis response program, granting humanity temporary Council observer status for the duration of the response effort?" Vel looked at the room. "Delegates will signal intent to speak before addressing the chamber. We will hear from each delegation in order of seniority. Voting will follow." What followed was 40 minutes of the most intense and unsettling diplomatic exchange I had ever translated. The Vorith precept spoke first. It was careful. It acknowledged the data. It acknowledged the seriousness of the projected threat. It noted that the Council had long-standing protocols for exactly this kind of large-scale existential risk assessment and that those protocols existed for good reason. It argued, in the graceful, layered way the Vorith always argued, that any response should proceed through proper channels, which would require time, which was available given the 40-year timeline, which made haste inadvisable. I translated faithfully. I did not soften it. I also did not miss Yara Osei's expression as I relayed this to her. She was not surprised. She had expected this. It made me wonder what else she had expected. The Dreth Collective's primary voice surprised everyone. The Dreth, whose entire history with humanity could be summarized as complicated, spoke in favor of cooperation. The reasoning was blunt, which was characteristic of the Dreth. The data was real, the threat was real, and any civilization that had demonstrated it could neutralize a 6-vessel patrol group with a converted freighter was a civilization the Dreth would rather have on the same side of a problem. I translated this. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Yara received it without expression. Callum Ward made a small note on his datapad. The San Federation voted against. Their delegate argued, carefully and at length, that the human delegation's arrival itself represented a violation of quarantine protocol and that rewarding protocol violations with council access would set a dangerous precedent. This argument would have been stronger if the room were not simultaneously processing data about 17 dead stars. The smaller federations were divided. 2 for, 2 against, 1 abstaining on the grounds that they needed more time to review the survey data independently, which was a reasonable position and which I noted as the only one in the session that prioritized accuracy over politics. Then the delegate from the Orith minority, a single-planet civilization that had only held council membership for 60 years and had therefore never been taken very seriously by the larger powers, stood up. She was small, even by Orith standards, and she spoke quietly, which meant I had to concentrate to catch every word. She said, "The data shows that the phenomenon will reach the Orith home system in 31 years. The Council has debated this for an hour. The humans spent 14 months checking their data before they said a word about it." She looked at the chamber. She said, "I know which side I trust to have done the work correctly." She sat down. I translated. Something in the chamber shifted again. Then the debate deteriorated. A delegate from one of the Outer Rim groups, whose name I will not record because what they said deserves no preservation, stood and argued that the humans might themselves be related to the phenomenon. That their arrival at this particular moment, with this particular data, was suspicious. That the quarantine had been established for reasons that had not changed. That granting them any form of council access was a greater risk than the phenomenon itself. I translated this too. Faithfully. The way Yara had asked. I watched her face as she heard it. She did not react. Not anger, not contempt, not even the small tension around the eyes that most beings cannot fully suppress when they hear something unjust. She heard it, processed it, and remained still. It was one of the most controlled things I had ever witnessed. Then she raised her hand for the speaker's signal. Vel recognized her. We expected that argument, Yara said. Her voice was completely level. We have no response to it that will satisfy people who have already decided to believe it. So we will simply say this: the phenomenon's leading edge will reach human space before it reaches any system in this room. If we were engineering this situation, we would not have built that into it. She paused. We are not asking to be trusted. We are offering data and we are offering assistance. Trust is something that gets built over time. We are asking for time. I translated. The Outer Rim delegate sat down without responding. Vel called the vote. It came in as I had predicted to Yara during the recess. Deadlocked. 22 in favor, 22 against, with the San Federation declining to cast, which under council rules was treated as an abstention and did not break the tie. The last time the council had deadlocked on a formal response vote, it had been 612 years ago. The records showed what happened then. The tie-breaking mechanism came into effect. It was an old rule, written into the council's founding charter by its original architects, who had apparently possessed a sense of humor or at least an appreciation for symmetry. In the event of a tied vote, the deciding vote fell to the lowest-ranking council staff member present in the chamber at the time of the vote. Vel announced this. The chamber turned. Every visual organ, every directional sensor, every gaze in the room aligned on the same point. They were looking at me. I sat in the translator's booth above the chamber floor and understood, suddenly and completely, that this was the moment. Not a small moment. Not a procedural quirk that would be forgotten in next month's session notes. This was the kind of moment that gets written about. The kind that determines things. My hands were on the edge of the booth rail. I noticed, with some distant part of my mind, that they were not entirely steady. I thought about the Omega-9 files. I thought about the colony ship and 6 patrol vessels and the message that said you have 1 hour. I thought about 14 months of careful verification before a word was said to anyone. I thought about Callum Ward's simulation models, the ones he had shown me without hesitation, the ones that showed the cost of a single species response and did not flinch from what that cost would be. I thought about Yara Osei standing behind the chair, taking inventory of the room. Not impressed. Not afraid. Assessing. I thought about 17 dead stars. I thought about 31 years to the Orithome system. The chamber was very quiet. I found my voice. I vote, I said, and my voice came out steadier than my hands felt, in favor of cooperation. The chamber came apart. 3 delegations stood immediately and began moving toward the exits, loudly invoking procedural objections. 2 delegations began producing something that functioned, across their very different species, as applause, a rhythmic percussive gesture, not native to either of them, which I recognized with a strange lurch as a human custom they had clearly encountered somewhere in cultural records and decided to use in this moment, perhaps because nothing in their own traditions quite fit. The Outer Rim delegate who had made the suspicious argument was transmitting something to an off-station contact, voice low and rapid. Vel was calling for order. I looked at Yara. She was looking at me. Her expression was not triumphant. It was something quieter than that. Something that might, in a human being with different training and different years behind it, have been called grateful. She gave me a single nod. I nodded back. At the high seat, the Vorith precept had lowered its recognition tendrils again. All 6. Inward and bowed. This time I thought I understood the gesture better. It was not fear, not exactly. It was the expression of a 4,000-year-old being who had just watched an 11-year council employee cast the vote that the entire political machinery of the galaxy had failed to produce. It might have been respect. It might have been something even more complicated than that. Vel got the chamber back to order eventually. The 3 delegations that had stood down returned to their seats, still objecting but procedurally contained. The formal response vote result was recorded, confirmed, and transmitted to the full council record. Humanity was admitted to temporary observer status. The Joint Crisis Response Program was formally initiated. The most powerful diplomatic body in the known galaxy had been moved forward by the vote of its lowest-ranking employee. I sat in the booth with my hands on the rail and let out a very slow, very quiet breath. Then I pressed record again. We had work to do. The silence before the answer. 6 months later I stood in the command bay of a human warship and watched the edge of everything approach. The ship was called the Ward Line. Humans have a habit of naming their vessels after people, not ideas, which I had found puzzling until Callum explained it to me one evening during a long transit stretch. You want the ship to feel like it has someone to answer to, he said. Something personal. A name means it matters who was here. I had thought about this for a long time. I was still thinking about it. The Ward Line was not the largest vessel in the joint fleet. It was not the most heavily armed, though it was more heavily armed than it looked, which I was learning was something of a human design philosophy: build in more capacity than the exterior suggests, because you do not always know what the situation will require. The fleet we traveled with was assembled from 17 civilizations, a thing that would have seemed impossible 8 months ago and that was now, somehow, operational. Not smoothly operational. Not without significant friction and more than a few communication failures that I had spent weeks mediating. But operational. The Galactic Council's contribution to the joint fleet was substantial in equipment and complicated in coordination. The Vorith hegemony had sent 12 vessels, all of them significantly larger than anything humanity had commissioned. The Dreth had sent 9, fast and heavily armed, crewed by beings who had not entirely resolved their complicated relationship with humanity but had apparently decided that the present situation made those complications secondary. The San Federation had sent 6, reluctantly, with 3 separate conditions attached to their participation that had required individual negotiation, which I had conducted across 4 days without sleeping more than 3 hours at a time. Humanity had sent 41 ships. This was notable because, as the San representative had pointed out in the joint coordination meeting, humanity's fleet was technically still under partial quarantine restriction and had not been formally counted among council-recognized military forces. Yara's response had been patient and brief: the restrictions applied to peacetime expansion. This was not peacetime. No one had argued with that. The 6 months between the council vote and our arrival at the edge had changed things. Quietly. Not in ways that made the news transmissions or the formal diplomatic dispatches. In the small ways, the daily ways, the kind of change that only becomes visible when you stop and look at what was normal 6 months ago and compare it to what is normal now. The Vorith engineering team assigned to the joint fleet's maintenance rotation had spent 3 weeks working alongside human engineers before one of them asked, with great scholarly care, why human repair protocols always began with worst-case scenarios rather than most likely scenarios. The human engineer had shrugged and said that if you plan for the worst and only the medium bad happens, you are fine, but if you plan for the medium bad and the worst happens, you are not. The Vorith engineer had gone very quiet, then disappeared for 2 days, then reappeared with a completely restructured maintenance protocol document that reduced fleet repair time by 40%. It was now the standard. A Dreth weapons specialist had spent an afternoon in the Ward Line structural engineering bay, studying the framework diagrams with the focused attention of someone encountering a philosophical position rather than a blueprint. She had called Yara in eventually and asked a single question: why are your ships designed to function at reduced hull integrity? Yara had said that a ship that can fight at 40% is better than a ship that stops at 60. The Dreth specialist had stared at the diagram for a long moment and then said, quietly, that this changed several assumptions she had made about optimal military architecture. Her fleet's schematics were revised within a month. Callum, in the meantime, had become something of an unofficial liaison between the human navigation team and every other navigation team in the fleet, simply by virtue of the fact that he was the youngest person in any coordination meeting and therefore the least threatening, and also because his simulation models were, by any objective measure, the most accurate in the joint fleet. He ran projections for whoever asked. He explained his methodology patiently, multiple times, to analysts who found it counterintuitive. He had a gift for sitting with someone's confusion without making them feel inadequate, which turned out to be a skill in high demand when 17 civilizations are trying to coordinate a response to something none of them have ever encountered before. I watched all of this and translated it and recorded it and sent reports to the council, which were received and filed and occasionally acknowledged. I was no longer just translating words. I had not been just translating words for several months now. We reached the outer edge of the charted region on a clear transit day, which meant the navigation sensors were reading cleanly and the fleet had maintained formation through the last 3 jump sequences without any of the coordination delays that had plagued the early transit stages. Yara announced this over the fleet-wide channel with the matter-of-fact tone she used for all announcements, regardless of their weight. Fleet Command, this is Ward Line. We are at approach threshold. All vessels hold formation and begin full sensor sweep. We will not advance until all sweep data is compiled and shared across the fleet. She waited. The sweep took 90 minutes. I stood in the command bay and watched the data come in on the main display, the dark edge of the phenomenon, visible now not just as sensor data but as absence. Where the star field should have continued, it stopped. Not the gradual thinning of stars that marked the true outer rim, where systems grew naturally more sparse. An edge. A line. The boundary between the galaxy that existed and the galaxy that no longer did. It was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. Piotr Vance compiled the sweep data and brought it to Yara. They stood together looking at it. I was close enough to hear. Leading edge has advanced another 2.3 light-years in 6 months, Vance said. Consistent with previous rate. Within margin. Good, she looked at the display for a moment. The approach corridor we mapped still looks viable. Yes. And, Vance hesitated, there is something new. A signal. Very faint. At the leading edge. Not natural background radiation. Structured. Yara looked up from the display. Structured how? Repeating. Regular intervals. Like, he paused, searching for the right word, like a boundary marker. The fleet held its position. The signal was analyzed. Shared across every vessel's science team simultaneously. 17 different scientific traditions applied to a pattern that repeated every 47 seconds, clean and deliberate and undeniably intentional. The phenomenon was not a force of nature operating without awareness. It knew we were here. All fleet, Yara transmitted, I need lead commanders on the joint channel. Now. The channel filled with voices. I translated in real time, relaying between languages, keeping the information flow moving. Yara outlined what the signal meant, what it implied, and what she intended to do about it. We make contact, she said. We respond to the signal. We find out if there is communication possible before we find out if there is a fight necessary. The Dreth fleet commander, a veteran who had not expressed enthusiasm for any human idea in 6 months, said, and if contact is not possible, then we find out what is possible, Yara said. But we start with the option that does not cost us anything to try. There was a pause on the channel. Agreed, said the Dreth commander. I had been translating for 11 years. I had never heard a Dreth commander agree with a human suggestion. I made a note of it, because I noted everything, and because I understood that the small things were also important. Vance and the joint science team assembled a response signal in under 3 hours, which was remarkable given that they were working in an unknown medium toward an unknown intelligence with no prior contact framework of any kind. The response used the same 47-second interval as the marker signal, modified with mathematical structure intended to indicate intentional communication rather than mirrored echo. They transmitted it. 47 seconds. Then another 47. Then the leading edge of the phenomenon stopped advancing. Not slowed. Stopped. The entire fleet went quiet. Every sensor array, every analyst, every commander on the joint channel waiting. The absence of forward movement was measurable and clear and completely unprecedented in 18 months of data. It had never stopped before. It heard us, Callum said quietly, from his station beside the navigation panel. We do not know that, Vance said. But his voice lacked the certainty of a rebuttal. It had the sound of someone hoping to be corrected. The phenomenon remained stationary for 4 hours. Then the signal changed. It was not the same repeating marker. It was longer, more complex, structured differently, and it did something that made every science team on every ship in the fleet stop what they were doing and stare at their instruments. It used the mathematical structure from the human response signal. It had learned that fast. It had incorporated their communication attempt into its own signal within 4 hours of receiving it. Pyotr Vance looked at Yara and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, "It wants to talk." What followed over the next 6 weeks I will not attempt to compress into a simple account, because it was not simple and because compressing it would lose the texture of it, the long, difficult, beautiful, terrible experience of genuine first contact with something that was not malicious and not benign but was vast and old and had been doing what it was doing for reasons we did not yet understand. It was not a weapon. It was not an enemy. It was something that had been moving through the galaxy for a long time, following patterns established before any of the civilizations in the Joint Fleet had developed written language, and it had not previously encountered anything that stood still and sent back a signal instead of running. This is what the records will say, the formal ones, the ones submitted to the Council and filed in the archives. The phenomenon halted its advance in response to coordinated multispecies communication initiated by the Joint Fleet. Active engagement replaced passive approach. A communication framework was established over a 6-week period. The phenomenon's advance did not resume during this period. What the records will not fully capture is what those 6 weeks felt like from the inside. It was not triumphant. It was not the clean victory of a story that knew in advance it would end well. It was long hours and incomplete data and disagreements between the science teams about what signals meant and days where the phenomenon's responses seemed to become less comprehensible rather than more. It was Callum Ward running 3 consecutive 20-hour shifts when a critical pattern analysis required more processing time than the automated systems could handle. It was Pyotr Vance eating meals standing up because sitting down felt like stopping. It was Yara standing at the command bay viewport in the early hours when the ship was quiet, not pacing, not speaking, just standing, and I realized eventually that this was how she thought, standing still and looking at the dark and letting her mind do what it needed to do. It was the Dreth Fleet commander calling Yara directly one night, without going through the joint channel, and saying in blunt simple terms, "We would have run. You kept us here. This matters." It was the Vorith Precept, attending the joint communication sessions remotely from the Council station, sending a short personal message that arrived in my translation queue marked personal correspondence. It said, "I have lowered my tendrils 3 times since this began. I want you to know that the 3rd time was not fear. The 3rd time was something I do not have a word for in any language I speak. Perhaps your translator can find one." I tried. The closest I could find in any of the 17 languages I worked in was a word from an old human language, a word that meant the recognition that something important has changed and will not change back, not regretfully but completely. I sent it to the Precept. It did not reply, but the next morning the formal Council dispatch addressing the Joint Fleet for the first time used language that was warmer than anything in the standard protocol template. Small things. Daily things. On the 43rd day of the communication process, the phenomenon did something that none of the models had predicted. It contracted. Not much. A measurable degree, verifiable across all sensor arrays, a drawing back from the outermost edge of its current position. It did not advance. It pulled back. The fleet stayed exactly where it was. I was in the command bay when the readings came in. I watched Yara look at the sensor display. I watched her not react immediately, not celebrate, not exhale in obvious relief, but take the information in carefully and then turn to Vance. "What does the signal say?" Vance had been analyzing it for 6 minutes, which was fast for a signal of this complexity. "It's using our mathematical framework again. And there is a sequence here that repeats in the same structure as our boundary acknowledgement from week 2, he looked up. "I think it is asking us to confirm that we received the movement." "Confirm it," Yara said. Vance transmitted the confirmation. The phenomenon contracted another measurable degree. And then, slowly, over the following 18 hours, it continued. Not fast. Not completely. But steadily, measurably, verifiably, the leading edge of the thing that had consumed 17 stars began to move backward. The fleet channel stayed quiet for a long time. Then the Dreth commander's voice came through, very flat, very controlled, Ward line, please confirm sensor readings. Confirmed, Yara said. Another silence. Then something happened on the fleet channel that I do not know how to categorize except to say that I was glad my translation equipment was recording it, because I could not have reproduced it from memory. 17 different species, in 17 different forms of expression, made some version of the sound that sentient beings make when something they were afraid was impossible turns out to have been possible after all. Some were loud. Some were quiet. The Vorath contingent was completely silent, which I had learned to recognize as their version of the most intense possible feeling. Callum Ward put his datapad down on his console and looked at the sensor display and said nothing. His eyes were very bright. Somewhere down the corridor, someone started laughing. Not nervously. Properly. The way you laugh when you are very relieved and very tired and you do not have the energy to be dignified about it. Yara stood at the display and looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then she picked up the fleet-wide channel. Fleet Command, this is Ward line. All vessels, current position hold. Maintain sensor monitoring. Science teams, continue communication protocol. Rest rotation to begin on schedule, a pause. Good work, everyone. All of you. She set the channel down. She looked at the display for one more moment. Then she turned and walked to her chair and sat down for the first time in 11 hours, and I noticed that she allowed herself, very briefly, to close her eyes. I turned to my terminal. I had a report to write. I had been writing reports for the Council for 11 years. I had written reports about trade disputes and border negotiations and the formal dissolution of 3 minor federations and the admission of 4 new species to observer status. I had written reports in the dry, careful, deliberately unemotional style that Council documentation required, because the Council's records were not stories, they were records, and records were supposed to be precise and contained. I looked at the sensor display showing the phenomenon's measured retreat. I looked at Callum Ward's datapad with its simulation models, sitting on his console next to a cup of cold tea he had forgotten to drink. I looked at Yara Osei, sitting in her chair with her eyes closed and her hands resting in her lap, already, I knew, composing the next phase of the plan in the back of her mind even in the moments that looked like rest. I started to write. I wrote, they came to us afraid. They left us still afraid. This, I have come to understand, is what it means to be human. Not fearlessness. They are not fearless. I have watched them be afraid every day for 6 months, afraid of the dark at the edge of the galaxy, afraid of what the signal might mean, afraid of the math in Callum Ward's models that showed what the cost of failure would be. They are afraid. They simply refuse to let fear have the last word. I wrote, every other species I have ever observed, when confronted with something larger than themselves, has looked for the door. Humans look for the door too. They are not different in that way. But then they turn back. They look at the thing. And they decide that the thing can be approached and addressed, and sometimes, if the work is done carefully and with enough patience, answered. I wrote, the Galactic Council fell into silence when the humans came. I was in the room. I heard it. 47 seconds of silence from the most powerful diplomatic body in the known galaxy, because 7 words arrived and no one knew what to do with them. I know what to do with them now. I wrote, they came. They stayed. They did the work. They named the ship after a person. They checked the data 14 months before they told anyone. They said you have 1 hour, and they meant it, but they also said we are sorry for the delay, and they meant that too. They brought 41 ships to a problem that could have required 100, and they made those 41 ships enough by being thorough and patient and honest and relentlessly, immovably focused on the actual situation rather than the comfortable version of it. I wrote, I am a xenolinguist. I translate. I find the words in one language that carry the same weight as the words in another. I have spent 11 years trying to make sure that what one being means reaches another being without losing anything essential in the crossing. I have never been given a harder translation problem than this one. How do you explain humanity to a galaxy that has been quietly afraid of them for 200 years? I wrote, start here. The thing at the edge of the galaxy stopped when they stood still and sent a signal back. It had consumed 17 stars and crossed the outer rim, and it had never once, in all that time, encountered something that did not run. So it had kept going, because nothing had ever given it a reason to stop. I wrote, the galaxy runs. Humans stand still and send a signal back. I looked at what I had written. Outside the viewport, the fleet held its position in steady formation, 17 civilizations in 41 human vessels and 67 council ships, running their sensor arrays and maintaining their communication protocols and resting in shifts because Yara Ose had ordered rest in shifts, and she was not wrong about anything she applied that kind of attention to. The phenomenon was still retreating. Down the corridor, someone was still laughing. Others had joined in. Callum Ward picked up his cold tea, noticed it was cold, and went to get a fresh one. On his way past my station he looked at my terminal screen and said nothing, but he gave me the small nod he gave when he had read something and found it accurate. I sent the report. Then I did something I had not done in 11 years of council work. I saved a personal copy. Not for the archives. For myself. Because some things should be recorded not just as what happened but as what it felt like to be there when they happened. And this, I thought, watching the sensor display, watching the numbers, watching the darkness at the edge of the galaxy hold still and then, slowly, begin to pull back from the light, this was one of those things. The humans had come. The council had fallen silent. And then, because the universe does not actually stop moving for anyone's silence, the work had begun. And now, at the edge of everything, the work was holding. For today, that was enough.